Talking about the biggest stories that matter to you the most. Breaking news, John Calipari is finalizing a 5-year deal to become the Arkansas Razorbacks' next head coach, covering college sports like no one else. The biggest guests in sports. We now welcome in Hall of Famer Jim Calhoun.
Such a pride I had, I came to Connecticut.
The legend, Tim Tebow, joins us.
We'll run it back. I like it.
The legend, Herschel Walker. Welcome in, everybody. Monday night edition, Aaron Torres Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Torres. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody had a great weekend. Slowly but surely, we'll get back to the Sunday night into Monday schedule, so everybody has a new show live in their podcast stream on Monday mornings, as well as obviously on YouTube. But with SEC Media Day starting today, it felt like Monday would be the day to get rolling this week. And we'll go ahead and continue to look ahead at what should be a fun football season ahead. So let's go ahead and dive in. Today's show, listen, first time in a long time, it is all football, 100%. We are 2 feet in. We'll obviously keep you updated on anything basketball related. But from the football perspective, certainly plenty to talk about from day one of the SEC Media Days and beyond. Nick Saban, he's now in the media. And my man has some takes. So we'll talk about what Nick Saban had to say. We'll talk about what he said about Texas, about his SEC title pick. We'll also talk about a few other topics that popped up over the course of the weekend. My buddy Jason Shear covers Arizona, now in the Big 12. He had a very interesting Big 12 realignment update with Clemson and Florida State. Also, we will talk a little bit more about that Kalen DeBoer Alabama recruiting surge, because while you were doing whatever this weekend, Kalen DeBoer cannot stop picking up 5 stars. They now have the number 1 class in the class of 2024 in On3's rankings. And I'm here to say, baby, don't doubt DeBoer. By the way, one thing we will not be talking about, we'll be the only college sports podcast in America that won't be talking EA Sports. Bluntly, used to love playing the college football game. I'm in my 30s now. I have a wife now. Pretty sure that if I get the game, it will likely lead to a divorce because, I have a little bit of an addictive personality. So my hunch is that just maybe it's best that I do not play the game. So we won't be talking EA Sports. Possibility, by the way, that producer Matt makes his on-camera debut. He very much has the game, is starting to ramp up. He may come on and give his review, his critiques, his criticisms, and his positive reaction to the game sometime later this week. But again, we will be because I'm an old man, we will be the first and only college sports podcast that is not talking EA College Football 2024. Although I obviously do hope that all of you do have a copy of the game and are enjoying it. With that said, speaking of enjoying it, college football is here. There is no more time to waste. So let's go ahead and get to the topic of the day. And the topic of the day, as I said, look, bottom line, the topic of the day, you know what the topic of the day is. The topic of the day is that SEC Media Days have begun and football is here, baby. And I can't speak for anybody else, but I'm fired up. And what I'll tell you about SEC Media Days, I've kind of had a little bit of a change of heart about media days in general, specifically SEC Media Days, really over the last couple of years. If you're a longtime listener of this show, you know that really even up to about 3-4 years ago, I was kind of anti-SEC Media Days because it was always all this hype. Everybody shows up, and then you get previously 14, now 16 coaches, mostly just talking a bunch of coach speak. They don't really say anything interesting. They don't really do anything interesting. I mean, if you take out that crazy week when Texas and Oklahoma, when the news broke that they were going to the SEC at Media Days, really not a lot has happened. The last major story outside of the realignment that broke out there was that I think it was probably Johnny Manziel. If you remember, he got in a lot of trouble, got suspended to start the season, and SEC Media Days was kind of his first media availability after all of that. So if you're talking about Johnny Manziel as the most recent, like, high-profile thing that has happened at Media Days, it's been a minute. But at the same time, what does stand out to me about Media Days is that, as I said to lead this segment, it means that college football is here, and I think football in general is here. It is the official point in the summer where, yeah, we still got 6-7 weeks. Yeah, but we are getting close. When you see tan Brian Kelly and tan Kirby Smart and tan Kalen DeBoer fresh off the lake and straight to media days, you know that football is close. Obviously, from the NFL perspective, training camp is here. Teams are reporting. And so because of it, I've come to really like SEC Media Days for what it really represents. And that, to me, is the start of football. As I said, we will have plenty of basketball as stuff happens. But today it is all about football, all about Media Days. So the question with that, now that I've acknowledged that I love Media Days, it's one of my favorite events on the calendar. By the way, we will be there next year. We hope. Producer Matt and I could not make it this year. But I bring it up for the very simple reason of, when I think about Media Days, what stands out to me, what stands out about day one, was that you know who was the breakout star of day one? 4 coaches spoke. It wasn't any of them. Brian Kelly spoke, Lane Kiffin spoke, Clark Lee from Vanderbilt spoke, and Shane Beamer from South Carolina spoke. You know who was the breakout star? I think it was probably Nick Saban. That's right. My man is in the media, and my man has some college football takes that he wants to share. And what I'll say about Nick Saban, I give him credit, man. Listen, we all know, not coaching anymore. I don't think that's breaking news from SEC Media Day perspective. But look, you look at his career trajectory, his career arc, whatever. He retires. And even if you watch the NFL draft, you were like, oh, this guy's actually really good. But I was curious, once you get him on TV talking about college football, because everybody's great on the draft, right? Every player is great, every whatever. But what is he going to be like when you get into a situation where he's got to criticize other teams, other coaches, Alabama? He has to give credit to teams. Well, as it turns out, like I said, my man has takes because he came out firing to start Media Day. First thing that stood out about what Nick Saban said, first of all, he had this thing where he forgot his credential in his room and they didn't let him into Media Days. So that was kind of Nick Saban's welcome to the media portion of this segment. You don't have probably armed security. You don't have thousands lining up to see you just to walk into the building. But what really stood out was him being on that podium and spitting out those hot takes. And so the first one, remember, Texas and Oklahoma are now in the SEC. I think you know it. Well, Nick Saban was kind of asked about Texas. He had a lot of great things that he said about him. We'll get to those in a minute. But he also kind of brought down the gauntlet and the hammer on Texas. Here is what he had to say to SEC Network about the arrival of the Texas Longhorns.
Me is all these people asking these questions about how Texas always ran the conference they were in. They're not going to run the SEC. Because there's a whole lot of arrogant people in a lot of places in the SEC, so they can forget all about that. They'll be a good team and a great program, and Sark will do a great job, but that's not going to be a problem.
How about our main man, Nick Saban? Again, he's bringing takes, and he said, Texas, guess what? This ain't the Big 12. There ain't no Iowa States and whoever. Kansas is on the schedule, although Kansas is going to be pretty good this year. And so Nick Saban's coming out swinging on Texas. A couple things on that quote, and then I want to get to the bigger quote, which I thought was more interesting. That quote was interesting from 2 perspectives. First of all, just fundamentally disagree with Nick Saban. Said that Texas has been running their league for years. No, they haven't. They were really good last year. It's a credit to them. We have given them credit on this show. But at the same time, they were actually a wildly underachieving program for the last decade. You know, the last Big 12 title that Texas even played for? Now, admittedly, there was no Big 12 championship game for about 6-7 years. Remember, there was that rule that you had to have 12 teams, 2 divisions to have a championship game in your conference. So the Big 12 did not have one for a long time when they only had 10 teams. But I only bring it up. Last time Texas won a Big 12 title prior to last year, 2009. Colt McCoy was on that roster. And so, one, they weren't dominating. But 2, I think Nick Saban's bigger point is what I find to be the most interesting part of the entire Texas-Oklahoma arrival in the SEC. Now, I know in this case, we're talking about Texas. I think it applies to Oklahoma as well. But I also think Oklahoma, in my opinion, has a better understanding of what they're getting into now that they are in the SEC. When you look at Texas, Texas is coming to win this thing, and they may very well. But what I keep going back to with Texas is exactly what Nick Saban said. You're not going to come in and run this league. And to me, the biggest difference between the SEC and the Big 12. By the way, you can see all the over-under win totals on the bottom of the screen. Producer Matt has put those out for you. Yeah, people think Texas is going to be good, and I think they'll be good too. But the biggest thing about Texas is the week to week. How are you going to handle things? Because again, you can even go back to last season, and Texas fans don't want to hear it, and Texas fans get mad. But first off, they only played 2 teams the entire year that I would say were anywhere close to as talented as they were in the regular season. 1, Alabama, everybody remembers they won. But 2, they lost to Oklahoma, which is something I think a lot of people forget. But beyond that, it's the week-to-week grind of the SEC. And you go back to last year for Texas. It wasn't always easy in an inferior Big 12. Won by 3 in overtime against Kansas State at home. Won by 3 at TCU, which was not a very good team. Won by a touchdown at Houston, which was not a very good team. They fired their head coach. So I just look at Texas, and that week to week is what's interesting to me about how they handle this league. Now, the good thing for Texas, this is the good part, is that the schedule this year, listen, everybody thinks that Alabama gets all the scheduling breaks because the league office is in Birmingham. The league schedule could not have been much easier for Texas, okay? Now, I know they play Georgia, but everybody plays either Bama or Georgia except Texas A&M. But you look at Texas's schedule, I think this has to be, and I would wonder if there's an advanced metric that reflects it. Texas probably has the easiest schedule in the SEC this season. Yes, they play Georgia at home, but they only play 3 road games because remember, they play Oklahoma on a neutral. That counts as a road game. There are 3 road games: at Vandy, at Arkansas, at Texas A&M. Now, Texas A&M, rivalry game, last week of the season. I know that one's going to be huge. Kyle Field is going to be rocking. I also know, by the way, I've never been to a game at Razorback Stadium, but I've been in it. That place is monstrous. It looks like it gets very loud on TV, and I have no doubt that it will be loud for Texas late in the season. Now, it's worth noting they don't play at Arkansas until November 16th, and that's significant because Sam Pittman might not even be the head coach by then. So I could go on, but at least from Texas's perspective, they get a little bit of a break with the schedule. No Alabama on the schedule, no Ole Miss on the schedule, who is very good, no Missouri on the schedule, who's very good, no Tennessee on the schedule, no Auburn. I mean, there's just a lot of advantageous games for them. So that was Nick Saban hot take number 1, which was that he believes that that Texas, it is not going to be the same now that they are in the league. Beyond that, though, you want to start to talk about Nick Saban coming through with some scorching hot takes, because when I tell you that Nick Saban came in firing on another take, how about this? Nick Saban picked his SEC champion, the teams that he believes will play in the SEC title game in Atlanta. Remember, who's the reigning champ? It's the Alabama Crimson Tide. Well, Nick Saban does not have Alabama playing for the SEC title this year. Here is what he had to say. He said, quote, "I think it's Georgia and Texas." What? He said, but I don't think there's any team, in his defense, he said, I don't think there's any team right now or any coach that you would talk to, including myself for many years, that right now there's not some part of their team they're concerned about. How these problems sort of get resolved, whether it's a young player that comes in and makes an impact or an older player that develops consistency, those are the question marks that I think make it impossible to make predictions right now. He continued, I think Texas, if their defense comes through and they can replace some of their interior people that they lost that were high draft picks and all that, they were really good offensively. Even though their quarterback, Quinn Ewers, has missed time, Arch Manning was lights out in the spring game. Like, Arch was 21 of 25 for 347 yards. So that depth at quarterback is probably really important for them because Ewers has missed time the last couple years, a game or two, which could really affect where you end up. He continued, I really like Texas. I think Georgia's got a good team. Then the important part. He said, I believe in our Bama team too. I believe in Jalen Milroe. I just think the question marks in the secondary, until those get resolved, it's hard to sort of jump on the bandwagon. And so you talk about a spicy meatball of a quote. How about Nick Saban coming out and saying he don't believe in Alabama? Say what? He doesn't believe in Alabama? What are we talking about here? So fascinating thing. But and by the way, what was actually really fascinating about it, let me say this, is that what was really fascinating about it is a couple things stand out. One, what stands out to me most, first of all, I thought the reaction on social media was really funny because there was like two waves of Bama fan reaction. There was the Bama fan reaction that said, he doesn't believe in us. Who is he? We can't trust this guy. We're out on Nick Saban. And I think it was a little bit hyperbolic. I don't think anybody was really that fired up, but you know how Bama fans are. And by the way, remember last year, they lose to Texas. The conversation becomes what they called lank at Alabama in Tuscaloosa. Let all naysayers know. That was what lank was. And so they started calling Nick Saban the number one naysayer on social media today. But what was even more interesting was that after that moment in time where every Bama fan kind of sort of turned on Nick Saban, a lot of them kind of asked the question. They said, well, wait a second now. Wait a second now. Is it possible that this is some reverse psychology? That he's actually putting it out there so that they have some bulletin board material in Tuscaloosa? That they can now say that the guy who knows us better than anybody else except for Kalen DeBoer doesn't believe in us? Was Nick Saban actually doing Kalen DeBoer a favor? So I found it very interesting, but let me just kind of quickly wrap by saying this. I actually give Nick Saban credit because just in those two quotes, in the Texas quote and then in the quote on the SEC championship, you know what actually stood out to me? What actually stood out was that Nick Saban is clearly taking this job seriously. And the one thing about, successful people that transition into the media, whether it's former players, former coaches, I'm sure in other media as well, but let's stick with sports here, is oftentimes those people just don't take the job seriously. They either don't do their homework, feel like it's beneath them, or the opposite. They're angling for another job. They don't want to say anything too controversial. As I said to lead the show, they're worried about upsetting somebody. They have a buddy at this school. They have a buddy at this place. Their former assistant is there. Their best player is there. Their agent's son is the court. There's always a reason to not criticize and not give strong opinions. So the fact that Nick Saban said what he said at Media Day on Monday, I think it's actually a great sign for college football and college football consumers, because what it means is he's doing his homework, he's prepared, and he's not afraid to say exactly what he feels. It would have been easy for him to go to the podium and say Georgia versus Bama, and I'm taking Bama because how could I not take Bama? But the fact that he said, no, probably right now, Georgia and Texas are the better team. I think Alabama can get there. I love Jalen Milroe, but there are just a few too many questions. To me, it feels like a guy that is ready to do his homework, ready to say what he needs to say, and not afraid to say something controversial. All right, so what we're going to do, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back. When we come back, we are going to hit on a few different things. A very interesting update in the realignment world of college football. And Kalen DeBoer can't stop picking up 5 stars. This guy is a machine on the recruiting trail. We're going to take a quick break. We will be right back. Show in a minute, but before we do, many of you ask me all the time, Torres, what can I do to help support the show? You give me hours and hours and hours of content every single week. What can I do to help you? Well, I'll tell you what, do me a quick favor. Check out the Aaron Torres Media merchandise store for all of your team-specific shirts, hats, and more, all available at aarontorresonline.com/merchandise. A lot of you wondering, Torres, what can I get in that merch store? Well, first of all, we got our brand new Hope and Pope Kentucky basketball t-shirts. That's right. Mark Pope has arrived. He is here to save the day. Get your Hope and Pope t-shirts there. Also, Arkansas fans, the Big Pig Invasion is here. You can get your tees there. Basketball School Alabama shirts. Mora Hurley 2024 UConn shirts for your tailgates at Rentschler Field, your games at the XL Center or Gamble. And oh, by the way, your Mike effing Woodson gear for Indiana. If you love football, we got you covered too. We got more Dion shirts and hats than we even know what to do with. The freeze warning has hit the plains. Auburn fans, grab your freeze warning tees now. And of course, our new era, new rules shirt applies to Nebraska football and its incredible fan base. We have more coming for the fall, plenty in stock right now. So make sure to check out the Aaron Torres Media merch store at aarontorresonline.com/merchandise. And you can always hit me up with any questions. Aaron Torres Podcast Questions at gmail.com. All right, everybody. I'm back. Good to be back. Good to be back. So during the commercial break, went on social media, saw that Skip Bayless is apparently leaving First Take or Undisputed. That's certainly an interesting one I wasn't expecting. If we get any interesting updates, we'll talk about that at some point this week. By the way, saw Sean in the comments say, ask Texas what it was like last time that they came to Fayetteville. We were talking about Texas and Nick Saban's comments. I agree 100%. I don't think people realize how hard that venue is to play in, and that's the bigger picture of Texas and Oklahoma, which is, are those teams fully understanding what the week-to-week grind of the SEC is like? So we'll continue our conversation about the SEC. We got about 5-6 weeks to lead up into college football. Also, by the way, again, I know I keep saying it, if there is basketball news, recruiting is starting to ramp up here as Peach Jam kind of comes to an end in the next few days. We will get to it on this show, but for now, it's a lot of football. So with that said, let's stay on the football, but we're not really talking football as much as we're going to talk the bigger picture of college sports. And I want to go ahead and do a big picture update on a conversation that we had late last week, okay? So if you listen to the show, you know that we talked realignment last week, and specifically Florida State and Clemson and their unhappiness in the ACC. Now, if you listen to the show, it was kind of during Big 12 Media Days, and what was really interesting was nobody would come out and say that there is a seismic move coming, because bluntly, there might not be. There's a lot of legalese involved, which we'll talk about in a minute, but the undertones seem to reflect that there might be some sort of move coming here in the coming, probably not days, but weeks or months, and certainly years. As I said, Brett Yormark, last year at Big 12 Media Days in 2023, he famously said, we are open for business. About a month later, the Pac-12 falls apart. 4 of those teams go to the Big 12. Also, saw my buddy Josh Pate, 24/7 Sports, say he has heard something is going to happen with Florida State in the coming weeks and to keep an eye out for it. And so I bring it up because it just feels like there's something in the air that's going on right now, and it doesn't feel like specifically Florida State and Clemson are happy. Well, why do I bring it up? It was because on Sunday night, my buddy Jason Scheer, who covers Arizona for 24/7 Sports, put out a bombshell of a tweet that I want to talk about now. Producer Matt, do we have the tweet available from Jason Scheer? Jason Scheer covers Arizona for 24/7 Sports, said, according to sources, there is an internal belief in the Big 12 that Florida State and Clemson are likely to join the conference within the next year or so. So, there's a lot to peel back. There's a lot to dive into. I saw my buddy Jason Scheer take a lot of heat for that tweet because it was a little bit vague. But sometimes when you're dealing with nuanced situations like this, it does get vague. So he said, according to sources, there's an internal belief in the Big 12 that Florida State and Clemson are likely to join the conference within the next year or so. So again, I know we live in this world where everything needs to be concrete, where everything needs a definitive answer. But what I will tell you, if you are not familiar with Jason, What you need to know is this. Been on the Arizona beat for a very long time. I think he's one of the best beat writers in America, and not because he's my buddy, but because he covers the crap out of that beat. He knows everybody, not only at Arizona, but at other schools, in the various league offices. And so when he says something, it carries weight. I'll take it a step further. Last year, during all the realignment stuff with the Pac-12 and the Big 12, he was the one that was breaking every single story. Wasn't one of these national guys at The Athletic, all the big J's at The Athletic, all the big J's at On3. Jason Scheer was a step ahead of everybody on these topics. So if he says that he believes it's going to happen at some point, then I think it is going to happen. Now, there is a couple nuances to that. Obviously, the big one is there are reasons that it can't happen right away. There are many reasons, as a matter of fact. The first one, Florida State and Clemson are legally tied to the ACC for the very foreseeable future. We've talked about it a million times. I'm not going to go deep into the details because we've discussed it. But remember, ACC has a TV contract that runs through 2036. So we are talking about a situation where the ACC teams are tied together for another 12 years. What's important beyond that is it's not just a 12-year commitment. There is what's called a grant of rights, which means that the ACC, the Atlantic Coast Conference, has exclusive rights to broadcast all of those schools' home games. And if you break it, we are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars that these individual schools would owe to the ACC. So Florida State and Clemson can leave if they want, but to get their broadcast rights broadcasted anywhere else, it's like $200+ million that they would owe to the ACC. And so there's no easy answers. That's why they are suing the ACC. But at the same time, what I have learned doing this as long as I have, and I've been in this game for a long time, okay? What I have learned is that ultimately, when a school wants, first of all, if you hear something for long enough, generally it's going to happen. You can go across sports, right? We heard for a year before Kevin Durant went to the Golden State Warriors, oh, KD might actually go to the Warriors. And you're like, no, he won't. What are we talking about? He's not going to go to the Warriors. And then he went to the Warriors. You know, you go on and on down the list, fill in the blank, whatever. I mean, there are just stories that it feels like they're out there. Kevin Durant to the Brooklyn Nets. He's going to go to New York. He wants to go to New York. So that's a perfect example. And two, even if things don't make sense on paper, even if there are financial hurdles, it feels like ultimately, especially in college sports, these schools always find a way. Remember, Texas and Oklahoma were not supposed to leave for the SEC until next year. And they fought and they fought and they fought. And they pushed back and they negotiated. And then they eventually got to a place with the Big 12 where the Big 12 said, hey, we're going to 16 next year anyway. You guys can get out for this price. So while it's going to take some time, it just feels like there's too many things going on for this not to be something. Now, again, as Jason said in his tweet, he's great at what he does. It's complicated. It's not going to happen tomorrow. There's no bombshell tweet that's going to, rock SEC media days like Texas and Oklahoma a few years ago. That's not what's going to happen. But at the same time, it feels like it's going to happen. And when I see that, two very interesting things come to mind. First off, for months now, another thing that we've been hearing, what have we been hearing? And this is a little bit nerdy, but it is important in the context of college football or in college sports in general. We've heard that private equity money might be coming to college sports. In other words, one of these venture capital firms, and I'm no VC expert. I don't live in the Bay Area. I don't, raise Series 2, whatever, but that private equity might be coming to college sports. Now, why that's interesting is because the belief, in my opinion, and not only in my opinion, but everybody that I talk to, has always been that basically if there was money that came into college sports, it was going to go to the Big 12, but it was going to go to the schools in the Big 12 to basically get them on an even playing field and even footing with the SEC and the Big 10. The SEC and the Big 10 are making tens of millions of dollars more annually, year over year over year, than the ACC and the Big 12. And so the thought was if the SEC and the Big 10 are at like $70 million each, the Big 12's at like $40 million per school. The thought was you take the private equity money, you give it to your schools. Now they got an extra $30 million. So any facility that an SEC school does, any coaching hire that an SEC school wants to make, you can match it, you can exceed it, you're on an equal playing field. The flip side to that is if we know or if we think private equity is coming, is that private equity just going to go to Clemson and Florida State to basically give them a bailout to get out of the ACC? Again, we're talking about tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in money to get out of that ACC contract. But then from there, this is where it gets complicated. You give all that money to Florida State and Clemson. I guess my bigger question would be, now they're coming to another conference where they're not making nearly as much money as the SEC and the Big Ten. And I thought the whole point of Texas or Florida State and Clemson leaving the ACC was to go to a place where they were either in the SEC or the Big Ten, or they were on equal footing financially. And so to me, I'm not a math major. We don't know the numbers in terms of private equity, but what stands out to me is it feels obvious that if Florida State and Clemson are going to go, that they would need a significant bump in terms of, a financial incentive to do so. And so then you're talking about if you're going to give them that much to get out of the deal and then get them back, get them on equal footing as the SEC and the Big Ten. And I'm sorry for getting super nerdy, but these are important details. I mean, you could be talking about $500 million that you need to take out in private equity money. Can you ever make that back? So that's interesting. Part number one. Part number two, by the way, is, I keep hearing, because I've heard this from Big 12 fans. Well, Florida State and Clemson, they just want to come to the Big 12 because it's more stable than the ACC. It's like, well, it's more stable than the ACC because the ACC is unstable because Florida State and Clemson won out. Like if Florida State and Clemson committed through 2036, it'd be just as stable as the Big 12. So I find that interesting. But what I also finally find interesting, and then I do want to switch gears, talk a little bit about, a monster recruiting weekend at Alabama. What I also do find interesting is the idea that if they can somehow wrangle out of this contract, does it bring the other conferences, the SEC and the Big Ten, in play? Now, I know Greg Sankey, day one of SEC Media Days, said we are solely focused on the schools that we have right now, the 16 schools. We're not looking to expand. We're not looking to add. We're not looking to this. We're not looking at that. But at the same time, if you can get Florida State and Clemson, you add two more monster brands, and you basically kill off the ACC. I don't know how you don't at least consider it. And I know what people would say, well, the college football play. It's like, look, we're getting to a place where all of the power in college football. Now, I can't speak to where college basketball is going to be, where college softball is going to be, where college baseball is going to be. But we're getting to a point where all the power is going to be in the SEC and the ACC anyway, unless somehow Florida State and Clemson go to the Big 12. Then it's a different conversation. So for me, it doesn't really matter in the SEC if we're talking about adding two more really good teams. Well, they just added two more really good teams. And what cracks me up is this idea of like, it's like, this is why they shouldn't have added Texas and Oklahoma, in my opinion. How much money, you get so much money, but at what cost? What's going to happen to all those schools in that second tier of the SEC that are now bumped back because of Texas and Oklahoma, that now have two more tough schools to get over because of Texas and Oklahoma? Now you have Clemson and Florida State. Big Ten's a little bit of a different deal. Big 10, is clearly a national brand. Big 10 very clearly from coast to coast, Rutgers to Seattle, LA to whatever, West Lafayette, Indiana. The one part they don't really have a foothold is the southeast part of the country. Obviously, you'd be going into the southeast part of the country. And I think right now you'd be arguably taking the best brand, at least the most successful one right now in Florida, but then also the most successful one in South Carolina by a mile. So it's interesting. The counter to that would be those schools aren't very good academically. Remember, there's this thing called the AAU. It's kind of a group of big-time college football or college academic, kind of whatever you want to call it. And basically, the Big Ten has historically only added teams that were involved in the AAU. UCLA, USC, Washington, all really good academic schools. But I just bring it up because this is fascinating. And Scheer is on top of his stuff. And if he says he thinks it's happening, I trust him. But there still is a lot of just nuance that's involved. Where does the money come from? How does it get dispersed? How does Clemson and Florida State get out of the TV contract? And then if they do, is there a more appealing option than the SEC or the Big Ten? So it's fascinating. Again, I'm not sitting here and saying that something's going to happen today or tomorrow or the next day or in a week or a month or a year. But those schools are very clearly unhappy, and I am just fascinated to see where this goes from here. All right, let's go ahead and wrap with one other story. Again, we're ramping up the college football stuff. Appreciate everybody's support who is joining us here on a Monday night. A lot more football coming. But let's go ahead and do another follow-up from another story that we talked about last week. And last week, or maybe it was 2 or 3 weeks ago at this point, we talked about the recruiting efforts, if you're watching on YouTube, of that man in the bottom corner, Kalen DeBoer. Kalen DeBoer is the new head coach at Alabama. And I know that Alabama recruiting at a really high level is not really a story in the grand scheme of college football. Recruited that way forever. Nick Saban has been there. They've basically been in the mix for number one recruiting classes every single season. But at the same time, we also know how the reaction was when Kalen DeBoer got the job at Alabama. Oh, he's not going to be able to recruit. Can't go to the Southeast. He's from the Pacific Northwest. He's only been at the Power 5 level as a head coach for 2 years. Washington never recruited an elite level. Producer Matt, give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down, but I'm pretty sure at some points they started calling him Husky Harsin. In other words, they said, this guy's going to be Alabama's Brian Harsin. He's going to be out in 2 years. We're going to have to make up some stuff to get rid of him because he's going to stink, and we're going to send him back to the Northwest where he came from. Not saying that's where Bama fans were, but that was where about 13 other SEC fan bases were when he got hired. Well, I bring it up because a few weeks ago, we talked about this man, Kalen DeBoer, and this incredible staff and this incredible recruiting class he put together because it was about 2 weeks ago. End of June, we get to the end of the June recruiting cycle, and he has a monster push. Micah DeBose, number one offensive lineman in the state of Alabama, commits. Dijon Lee, a big corner, like 6'3", 6'4" cornerback from the state of California, commits. And all of a sudden you look up, Bama had the number 2 recruiting class in America, number 1 in the SEC. I think DeBose got them from 3 to 2, but you get the point. They had the guy that they said could not recruit at the highest levels about 2 weeks ago had the number 2 class in America, number 1 in the SEC. That itself is not bad. The problem for those other 15 SEC fan bases, I think I said 13 before, 15 SEC fan bases, is this. While you were sitting around, while you were at the pool reading your preview magazines this weekend, Kalen DeBoer and his staff got after it with not 1, but 2 5-star commitments to add to the recruiting class that he already has. So let's go ahead and get into it because right now, as I record here, Alabama, according to On3, has the number 1 recruiting class in America. And we've got an old saying here at the Aaron Torres Pod YouTube, and Aaron Torres Media. It's this. Don't doubt DeBoer. Don't doubt DeBoer. That's right. You can see at the bottom of our screen, AaronTorresOnline.com/merchandise. We're actually selling tees now. We sold a bunch of them over the weekend. You can see it on the screen. Don't doubt DeBoer. Thank you, producer Matt. Let's get into what happened this weekend. So this weekend, like I said, you're sitting there reading your playoff or your preview magazines, not a care in the world, feet up, feet in the sand, whatever. Well, on Saturday, because I know that's what I was doing. I was at a pool on Saturday, celebrating my wife's birthday. Happy birthday, sweetheart. And I had a preview magazine in hand, and I'm reading about this school and that school and whatever. Check my phone. Caleb Cunningham, 6'1" wide receiver, number 3 wide receiver in America, according to 24/7 Sports, commits to Alabama. This was an interesting recruitment. It had been projected for weeks. He was an interesting story. Took a visit the last week of the June recruiting period. And on that visit, as soon as it was done, all the crystal balls started rolling in for him. He actually went on my buddy Ryan Fowler's show, and he told Ryan, first of all, when you're doing interviews with the local media before you even commit, there's a pretty good chance you're going to commit. But beyond that, when he did that interview with Ryan Fowler, what he said was, I was ready to commit this weekend, but I promised my family I'd go home, think it through, maybe, take some visits in the fall, but boom, mid-July, done, committed to Bama. Now, if that was all that Kalen DeBoer did this weekend, that'd be a heck of a weekend. Not many schools anywhere in America are going to get a 5-star committed this entire cycle. But he wasn't done. Because on Sunday, Ty Haywood, big 6'6" offensive tackle from the state of Texas, had just taken visits to Texas A&M, Florida State, I believe, or he took 3 visits over the course of June outside of Bama. I know Florida State was one, A&M was another. And I bring it up because he committed on Sunday to the Alabama Crimson Tide. So in one 24-hour period, Kalen DeBoer got 2 5-stars committed. They move up to the number 1 recruiting class in On3's rankings. They have the number 1 player rating. In other words, the average player ranking per commit is number 1 in the country according to 24/7 Sports. They have 5 5-stars according to 24/7 Sports, the most in America. And so again, just don't doubt DeBoer. Now, what I would say about this whole situation is this. Listen, I'm a huge recruiting guy. We don't talk about it a ton on the show. I always say in basketball, we can talk recruiting because one player can change a program. In football, you need to stack really good player on top of really good player. And then you need to do it 2, 3, 4 years in a row to have a roster that's really built to compete with Georgia and Alabama and Ohio State and whatever. But at the same time, this is fascinating because I was told it couldn't be done. Not by this guy, not by this staff. Well, the one thing I can tell you, the one thing that I have learned doing this as long as I have done it, is that when you have a smart person in charge of your program, football, basketball, baseball, women's basketball, I'm sure tennis, golf is all the same, you can recruit and you will figure it out. And that, to me, Kalen DeBoer is the best example yet, but I use all different examples. Think about even in basketball, Nate Oates, and I've said this before, Nate Oates went from high school head coach to the SEC in a decade. You don't think you have to be really smart to do that? And you don't think you're going to figure it out once you get there? Pretty sure you'll be able to figure it. If you go from Romulus High School to Tuscaloosa, Alabama in a decade, you know what you're doing. Also, and by the way, that applies all sorts of different things. And so when it comes to Kalen DeBoer, I was never worried because he was going to figure it out. By the way, you know how I knew he was built for the SEC? Because we've talked about this before. When he got on the flight from Seattle to Tuscaloosa, there was only one coach with him. There's only one coach with him. It was Courtney Morgan, his player personnel guy. It wasn't his offensive coordinator, Ryan Grubb, who sort of followed him in Tuscaloosa, left after a week for Seattle, back to go to Seattle. Wasn't a defensive coordinator, wasn't a line. It was his player personnel guy. And so Courtney Morgan is the guy spearheading this thing. That guy's got connections everywhere. By the way, he's like a cult hero in the state of Alabama right now, at least for Alabama fans. They added Aaron Hodges to the staff, one of the best recruiting staff members in America. We've talked about him everywhere he goes. They sign top classes or the best class in school history. And so I just bring it up to say I always knew he was going to figure it out. Now, the more interesting thing to me, are we sure they're done? And just how good is this class going to get? Because I know what people will say the opposite. They'll say, oh, it's going to fall. These guys aren't all going to make it till National Signing Day. And what I always say to that, go through the history books. There might be a player who decommits one way or the other. Might be committed to Florida State or Miami, ends up at Alabama. Might be committed to Alabama, ends up at Florida State and Miami. But for the most part, when guys commit early, unless there is a coaching change like at Texas A&M last year, or the season goes completely sideways, everything falls apart, it's colossal disaster like Florida last year, which at one point had the number 3 class and lost 4 or 5 impact guys, generally, you don't lose big volumes of guys once they commit. That's a myth. It's simply not true. Could you lose a guy or 2? Yes. But you don't lose 8 blue chip guys unless the coach changes. And so that's a myth. And the other thing I keep going back to with DeBoer is I don't think he's done. They're in the mix for a bunch of other big name players. Derek Meadows, an elite wide receiver, a couple other guys on the defensive side of the ball. But here's what I keep thinking with Kalen DeBoer. Because I keep hearing, first I heard he couldn't recruit. But then I hear, well, if Alabama goes 9-3, the fan base is, first of all, the fan base isn't going to turn. They love him. They know that, to use a quote from his old boss, this is a process. But 2, and I think this is important as well. This to me is important, is that everybody's talking about the worst case scenario. What if they lose all these games? What if they finish 8-4 and miss the playoff? What about the opposite? What if they actually exceed expectations and are better than anybody thinks? Like, nobody talks about that scenario. Like, they played Georgia in week 4 at home. I think it's the last weekend of September. Like, what if they beat Georgia? You don't think that's going to have an uptick in recruiting? By the way, they play at LSU, at Tennessee, at Oklahoma. Those are hard games. I'm not saying they aren't. But you know what Oklahoma, Tennessee, and LSU have in common? They're all starting a first-year starter at quarterback. Nico Imamalieva has started 1 game in his career. Garrett Nussmeier started a lot of reps, but not a lot of game experience. Jackson Arnold started 1 game. It was a big L. Jalen Milroe's experienced. Jalen Milroe is one of the most experienced quarterbacks in the SEC. So I don't mean to go on and on. But this notion of it's going to fall apart, it's not. And if anything, I think it could look even better than it does right now, as opposed to it being worse. And I think, again, everybody focuses on the quote-unquote negative. What if it goes bad? What if it's a disaster? And yeah, what if it isn't? I'll tell you what. I think we're going to get out of here. By the way, we do have one comment on Nick Saban going after the Crimson Tide. He said, don't disagree with the fact that Alabama fans are a bit crazy, but we understand that Nick Saban has a job to do and that he is being a sports analyst, which needs to be unbiased as he can be. Plus a little bit of reverse psychology as well. So that's a great comment in there. And I agree. We were talking about earlier, Nick Saban actually picked against Alabama in the SEC. But you know what? That's okay. Tell you what, I do think it is time for us to get out of here. If you're not subscribed to the podcast, we very much need you to do so. And if you're not subscribed to YouTube, make sure to do so as well. If you're not subscribed on YouTube, go ahead, click the little subscribe button. The way I say it, everybody makes fun of me, but the button, make sure you're subscribed, put on notifications so you know when we're going live. We very much appreciate your support. Also, if you're not subscribed to the podcast, Apple, Spotify, do your boy Torres a favor and get subscribed over there. That's all for today's show. We will be back later this week again. I think producer Matt may be making his on-air debut, depending. Talk a little EA Sports. Is it in the game? We may find out.